Can everyone see our presentation? Beautiful. Well, welcome everybody. My name is Andrea Aldana. I'm Chief Program Officer at the Community Development Partnership, and I'm joined today by my co-speaker, our CEO, Jay Coburn, who you'll hear from in a moment, as well as Brad, Belinda, and Mallory from our housing advocacy team, and a few board members, and lots of familiar faces and not so familiar faces. So you're all very, very welcome to be here. Before I jump in, I want to let you all know that this meeting is being recorded. This workshop is being recorded, and it will be posted on our YouTube channel, which we've been running for a couple of years now. We do about 5 of these workshops on various housing topics per year. I'll explain why and a little bit more about our Lower Cape Housing Institute in just a moment. And we've been posting those recordings on our YouTube channel. So once this gets posted, we will let you know that it's there, and you can hopefully share it with as many people as you possibly can so we can help educate more folks about housing. I ask that you all please mute yourself, and we are going to address how to manage questions in just a moment, but please do keep yourself muted so that the audio is nice and clean. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. The CDP has been around since 1992. We lead the Lower Cape in building a diverse year-round community of people who can afford to live, work, and thrive here. And to accomplish this, we promote, develop, and manage affordable housing, nurture the launch of small businesses, facilitate collaboration with businesses, nonprofits, and government partners. The questions that you see on your screen are the general topics that we're going to be addressing today. Because there are a nice group of you, what we'd like to do instead of doing a poll is in the chat, would you please post your name, the town that you live or work in, and your affiliation. So some of you are elected or appointed municipal officials. If that's the case, please add your town and the name of the board or committee that you're on. Some of you work with a social service provider, so please put your name and the organization that you work with. Whatever your connection is to the housing space, we'd love to hear if you could please post it in the chat. So we've been offering Housing 101, I think this is our 3rd time now, 3 years. And we've been doing the Housing Institute for closer to 7 years. And so we've come to learn that folks who are interested in learning more and digging into housing topics are really passionate, and so are we. And so in order to make space for that passion, we want to acknowledge that we do need to balance inquiry with advocacy. For the most part, this is most likely a housing-friendly group. So make sure that you are just keeping in mind the dynamics of the group, sharing the air. If there's something you feel really strongly about, make your point and let us discuss and move on. And just be mindful of the space that we're sharing with folks and that we're all most likely on the same page. And then please do share any insights you have at the end when we're addressing questions. We'd love to hear insights that you want to share. Just keep it brief and concise, and let's make sure that we're using everyone's time as efficiently as possible. I see you all posting in the chat. Thank you so much. As I said, the CDP has been around for almost 30 years. This is our mission. I will not reread it. So let me tell you a little bit about where you are right now. So this Housing 101 workshop is part of the Lower Cape Housing Institute, which we launched in 2017. And the Lower Cape Housing Institute is actually part of a broader program called the Lower Cape Community Housing Partnership. And what we're trying to do with the Lower Cape Community Housing Partnership is support the Lower Cape region. We cover the 8 towns of Lower Cape in addressing the housing crisis in the region. And we are doing that in 3 ways. A Lower Cape Housing Institute that you are now participating in, Lower Cape Housing Advocacy, and a public education campaign. The Housing Institute includes these workshops. Housing 101 in particular is a group that we decided last year to open up to the broader community. So it does provide housing information at an introductory level. And then we also go on to offer 4 to 5 additional workshops over the course of the year outside of the summer to delve deeper into some more advanced topics. The Housing Institute audience is primarily elected and appointed municipal officials and town staff. And so in addition to the workshops, which we've been offering virtually since COVID, we also facilitate sub-quarterly peer group meetings. So we have municipal officials and town staff from the Outer Cape and the Lower Cape actually getting together 4 times a year to share learnings, challenges, and build relationships across town borders, which hadn't actually happened up until around 2017. So that's something we're really excited to be a part of. At the end of the year, after town meeting season is over, we compile all of the housing related articles, anything that has potential to advance housing initiatives in the region and address the housing crisis. We put that together into an annual town meeting summary. And we've been doing that since 2018. And it's a really interesting resource, actually. All of you will be added to our Lower Cape Community Housing Partnership e-newsletter. So you will see this annual town summary in early summer. And it's one of the ways that we track our own success for the program. And it's a really convenient summary of what happened this year, how many dollars were allocated to housing, and what have we moved the needle on as a region. And like I mentioned, we have an e-newsletter which goes out about every other month / quarterly, and will give you, it's probably like the easiest way, your one-stop shopping for figuring out what's going on in the region around housing. Then the Lower Cape Housing Advocacy Program, the audience for that is really everybody else, recognizing that decision makers are both at the municipal level and also voters. Voters are decision makers. Voters have the power to change land use policy in our towns. And so housing advocacy is really about coalition building, and this past year we got into community engagement for real estate developments, which if you have questions about that, we would love to talk to you about how that's done. And then the third component is a public education campaign, which is a campaign that's designed to show the true face of people who live in and need housing. We've done it through print ads in the past, and we're exploring a video option this year. We'll know that the Lower Cape Community Housing Partnership is successful when we see towns implementing changes in zoning bylaws, which we are seeing little by little, that support housing development. We also want to see an increase in the number of affordable units on each town's subsidized housing inventory. If you're not sure what that is, you will learn in this session. And we also want to see towns increasing utilization of local funding for housing, including Community Preservation Act funding, but also other types of funding, which we will cover in this presentation. As for questions, we have a lot to cover. So please, we do ask that you hold your questions until the end. You have 2 options. If it's hard for you to remember your question at the end, I totally understand that. You can just go ahead and add your question in the chat, and we'll start from the beginning when we're done speaking. Or you could raise your hand using the Zoom feature. Don't actually raise your physical hand because it's going to be hard for me to see you while I'm sharing my screen. So do use the Zoom feature, which is at the bottom of your screen, depending on if you're on an iPad or a desktop. I can't really help you there because I don't know what you're using, but there is a Zoom feature that allows you to raise your hand, and that'll kind of like pop you up on my screen and make it obvious to me that you have a question. Or like I said, you can just post it in the chat, whatever you prefer. With that said, if there are any questions around logistics, I ask that you put it in the chat now, and my colleague Pelinda will try and help you out if you're having an issue. Otherwise, I'm going to move along. Bear with me 1 second. All right, so we can't talk about housing or affordable housing without having some kind of shared definition. So what is housing? So your home is where you spend most of your life. It's where you sleep, it's where you grow, it's where you experience relationships. People cannot bring their whole selves to any other aspect of their lives when their home is not safe or stable. And people make housing decisions based on personal priorities, their family, their relationships, their space needs, the cost, their lifestyle, the location. But housing is, at the end of the day, a fundamental aspect of stability for any household, regardless of the size. There are a number of components that make a healthy community, and safe and adequate housing is an important one. Housing meets 3 basic human needs: physical needs, because it's shelter; psychological needs, because it provides safety; and social needs, because again, this is where you experience your family and your close relationships. Without housing, families are under stress, and the lack of housing undermines our mental and physical health. For example, kids can't arrive at school ready to learn, families can't save for emergencies or retirement or college, and people can't manage the unexpected when their housing is not affordable to them. Let's talk a little bit about what a community with a healthy supply of housing can look like. So a community with a healthy supply of housing, which you will hear us argue is not the reality in our communities, it actually looks better. It's more interesting, it has more character, roof lines are broken up, and the community might look more like a village than a suburb. In a healthy community, you'll see a variety of sizes and types of housing. You'll see homes that are well sited, and there are good transitions between commercial and residential areas. And housing in a healthy community is close to the center of town to encourage walkable communities. And this is known as village-centered development. In bigger cities, you'll also hear about transit-oriented development. While we do, of course, have public transportation here, the sizes of our communities don't lend us so well to thinking solely on transit-oriented aspects, but we think about village-centered development as being the framework that really fits within our rural context. This website, missingmiddlehousing.com, offers some really great visual representations of what different housing types can look like. So when we say that healthy communities need to have different housing types, we mean there is more than just a single family home, right? On Cape Cod, we primarily see single family homes on 1 acre lots or bigger. And that is just one housing type. A healthy community has multiple housing types, whether it's duplexes, courtyards, townhouses. There is a broad range of housing types between the single family home and the high rises that most people agree they don't want to see here. There's a lot in between, and we need to see more of that. So please do check out this website to get a sense of all the different housing types besides just single family homes that can fit into our communities and give our residents more affordable options. A healthy community is also energy efficient, not only because they're cheaper to live in, but because their utilities are lower, they're sited closer to public transportation, and people don't have to get into their car as much to do the things that we all need to do on a regular basis. This image is actually from a development that we partnered with Preservation of Affordable Housing on in Wellfleet at 95 Lawrence Road. And that is a development that will be achieving net zero construction. And these are the types of things that go into high quality housing development. That is the type of energy efficient development that we want all of us to encourage more of in our communities. A healthy community has homes for people at all stages of life. A vibrant, thriving community means that there are people in our communities that have all different kinds of skills, that can fill all different kinds of jobs, and have all different kinds of levels of compensation, and different life experiences, and different household configurations. So we need to have housing inventory that meets people where they are at all stages of life, at all different price points. And that should lead for more economically diverse and racially diverse communities as well. That's what we think about when we think about diverse communities. And then finally, the 15-minute neighborhood is a useful framework, I think, to think about how we should be developing close to our village centers where we say housing belongs. So the 15-minute neighborhood can be defined as the ideal geography where most human needs and desires are located within a travel distance of 15 minutes by walking or riding your bike. So in the 15-minute neighborhood model, a 15-minute walk is about 3/4 of a mile, a 5-minute walk is about 1/4 of a mile. So you can use this as a way of imagining your village centers where housing and affordable housing should be concentrated near jobs, services, and amenities. And when you embrace this model, then it becomes really clear where we should be zoning for multifamily housing, where we should be putting these structures, and where we should be deciding density does make sense. We'll be talking about density quite a bit, and I just want to kick us off in that controversial topic by saying that in our communities, we have historically been really, really good about saying what should be in conservation, what should be dedicated open space, and we love open space too. We just say that At the same time, you should also be very clear about where housing should go, and both can be true. So what is affordable housing? Affordable housing means a couple different things in a couple different contexts, depending on who you're talking to. So it's not a quick and easy, here's a definition, but we will give you some things to consider. So affordable housing usually means that housing is priced to be affordable to households making between 30 and 80% of area median income. And we'll show you those numbers in a bit. We cannot get into all the ins and outs of affordability in one Housing 101 workshop, but we do encourage you to check out this resource. When we send you the link to the presentation, you'll be able to click on all of these links. And this is a really great glossary of terms from a community development publication that I love called Shelterforce. And so when we talk about affordable housing, you usually hear about the alphabet soup of affordable housing. There are a lot of terms, a lot of acronyms, and this glossary is a good way to dip your toes into the language of housing. So what does affordability mean? We refer to households rather than individuals in the housing space, and a household can be as little as one person. So a home is affordable to a household when that household spends no more than 30% of their income on housing costs, and that's whether it's rental or home ownership, and includes utilities. So it used to be 25% during the Reagan administration, but the definition was changed during the Reagan administration to be 30%. And the reason why I mentioned that is that even 30% is a lot of your income. And at one point, we all thought that 25% was more appropriate. So now it's higher, and that's just kind of food for thought. A household that spends more than 30% of their income on housing costs is considered to be cost burdened. And people who are cost burdened, households who are cost burdened, cannot afford to pay for other things associated with a good standard of living, like food, healthcare, education, etc. So it's a general metric that we use so that we can all have a shared understanding of affordability in our communities.
Andrea, could I just jump in and say too that this 30% figure is particularly important for low to moderate income families. That if you're making $150,000 a year, spending 35 or 40% of your income on your house still leaves a fair amount of cash coming in to live, save, deal with emergencies. But if you're trying to live on $30,000 a year and spending 10 of it on your housing, that doesn't leave a whole lot left to buy groceries, save for retirement, and handle unexpected challenges.
Exactly. Thank you. Now, in the housing space, or in the affordable housing space, you'll hear sometimes the concept of capital A or lowercase a, big A versus small a affordable housing. So homes can be affordable just because of how they're priced in a naturally occurring rental market, or because they're specifically created to be affordable for a specific income range. And I'll explain this in a second. The issue with this small a, so small a affordable housing, which I'll get to in a second, is what happens in a normal place that has a rental market, which we do not have. So in a normal rental market that's robust, where people are moving in and out of units, there are just naturally occurring rents that people in the region can afford. You will have a vacancy rate above zero, meaning like if you wanted to leave your unit, you could go find another apartment, but that's not the reality on the Cape. Our rental stock here has an effective 0% vacancy. So even when we talk about affordable rents, at the end of the day, when it comes to the rental market, we need to talk about inventory, which we do not have. So it really doesn't matter if rents are affordable, because our data it's based on data that's not scalable, because we don't actually have units. And maybe Jay, you can clarify that a little bit later on. But we just don't have a normal rental market, which is why we need to intervene to create big A affordable housing, which is subsidized housing. So naturally occurring affordable housing is the simplest way to explain it is that it's built without any government subsidy, and it's still priced affordably for most people in the area. For a variety of reasons that we'll touch on, the private sector has not produced housing that is affordable to people who live here year round. And this is why towns have to intervene, because the market is not serving this basic need for housing in our communities. In contrast, capital A, or subsidized or regulated housing, is a critical resource to our community so that we can have a community at all. And we produce this by intervening in the public sector to provide land and other resources in order to subsidize the creation of housing. And two common mechanisms are Chapter 40B and the Local Initiative Program. So Chapter 40B is a statute that allows developers to get local zoning relief in order to build more affordable housing through what is called a comprehensive permit. So a developer applies to a town, to ZBA, for a comprehensive permit through Chapter 40B. It has created the most affordable housing in the state compared to any other mechanism. It provides an incentive to towns that meet a 10% threshold by allowing them to be in what's called safe harbor. And being in safe harbor means that a town can reject an application from a developer for a comprehensive permit if they've already met that 10%. Towns can enter into safe harbor when they have a certified housing production plan and a certain percentage of new units over a 1 to 2 year period. And housing that counts toward that 10% is tracked through a tool called the Subsidized Housing Inventory. You'll also hear that called the SHI or the SHI list, and you can actually go to the Department of Housing Community Development, DHCD, and look up the Subsidized Housing Inventory in every town across the state to see how many units are in your town's housing inventory. The other typical way is through a local initiative program. So unlike conventional housing subsidy programs in which a state or federal agency must approve every aspect of financing design and construction, a LIP project, which is a project through the local initiative program, a LIP project, allows most of these decisions to be made by the municipality. So LIP regulations and guidelines address those program components that must be reviewed and approved by the Department of Housing and Community Development, or DHCD. And for example, incomes of households served, fair marketing, profit limitation, and establishing long-term affordability for the units which are built. And you can learn more about LIP through this link on the page. So let's get to the crux of the issue. Why don't we have a healthy supply of housing on the Lower Cape? A couple ways to think about it. One way is the affordability gap. So we know that we don't have a healthy supply because of the affordability gap. An affordability gap is an indication of housing stress. It represents the number of existing households spending 30% or more of their monthly income on housing and are therefore expected to be cost burdened. It worsens as you move away from the Mid-Cape, and we'll look at some data to see if we can paint the picture here. So one way to think about the affordability gap is just looking at, Jeff, can you please mute yourself? Oh, I can mute you. Got it. Okay. When we're thinking about the affordability gap, we're thinking, what is the median price of this home, whether it's rental or home ownership, compared to the median income? And if you look at this chart from the Cape Cod Commission, you can see, let's just look at home ownership. Home ownership lines are the blue bars, and the red lines are median household income. So the blue bars show the median home price in each town, and hopefully it's obvious that there's a big gap between the top of that blue bar and the red line below it. And so that means that people who live here are competing with off-Cape salaries who can afford those higher prices, and it completely outprices or outcompetes people who live here year-round, and therefore nobody that works here at a median household income year-round can generally get into the homeownership market. Now, if you look at the rental piece, is what I was saying before, we don't have a lot of good data on our rental inventory. So even though it looks like we can still, that folks who make a median household income can still afford to rent here, those rental units simply don't exist. And if you look at the Lower Cape, there is still a gap in every single town when it comes to home ownership. And you can dig into these graphs on the Cape Cod Commission's website. Do you want to add something, Jay?
Yeah. just to say that, so what this is saying is that in the town of Chatham, you need to have a household income of $180,000 a year in order to purchase the median price home in the town of Chatham. And the problem is that the median income in Chatham is not $180,000 a year. It's $80,000 a year, making it extremely difficult for the typical person in the community to be able to afford a home. So that is the gap that we're talking about, and it plays out a little bit differently in different towns. Throughout the Cape, the median home price of a home now is over $750,000. And that requires an income of $180,000 a year for a household to be able to qualify for a mortgage to purchase that home. The other thing I think it's important to remember when Andrea talked about the rental market, and particularly the market rate rental market. Our rental market has basically been eviscerated by the short-term rental platforms, and that the typical homeowner can make significantly more money in income renting their condo or their home out on a weekly basis or on a seasonal basis than they would make it if they rented it out year round at a market rate rent. And by a market rate rent, we mean like a range of between about $1,400 to $2,000 a month. You can still make a whole lot more money doing short-term rentals. And so therefore, we don't really have a naturally occurring market rate, let alone an affordable rental market in our community.
Thanks. And we're going to show the Provincetown example as well. So then there's market disconnection. So housing costs are a function of supply and demand, just like any other commodity. And we have a documented low supply of housing and housing production. We also have a lot of demand for the housing and land that exists. At least half of the vacation homes in the state were on Cape Cod pre-COVID, and we can only assume that that has been worsened through COVID. So we just don't have a normal housing market here on the Cape. And the result is that land values are high, and local year-rounders are always competing with the buying power of people from off Cape, often with higher salaries. Then there's the cost of building. So every aspect of building on Cape Cod is more expensive. And I'm going to throw some numbers at you that are pre-COVID. And Jay, if you know the impact post-COVID, please chime in. So pre-COVID, we were looking at off-Cape building costs of about $350,000 to build one unit of housing, $350 per unit. Affordable housing costs less to residents, but it doesn't cost any less to build than any other type of housing, which is why it's subsidized. On the Cape, pre-COVID, we were saying that our per unit cost was more like $400,000 per unit. And Jay, do you know how that number, do we have data on how that's changed?
Yes, so post-COVID, projects that are in the planning and permitting planning or going out to bid process are looking at development costs of more than $500,000 per unit and closer to $600,000 per unit. And I would just say as a caveat of that, and that profits in developing affordable housing are capped by law. So that's not why it's expensive. It's the labor and materials. And in some cases, the cost of land is what drives up the price of building housing, and in particular, affordable housing.
Yeah, and we talked a little bit about how the Cape housing market is different because of the additional pressure from second home purchasers. I would encourage you all to look at the Cape Cod Commission's second homeowner survey to dig into the data on this. But some things to note are that the most recent survey that was completed showed that 59% of second home purchasers have a household income of over $150,000, and 26% of them had previously owned property on the Cape. So again, it's this dynamic of people who work here year round and have maybe good jobs, just simply cannot compete with the buying power of off-Cape purchasers. And then, as Jay mentioned, short-term rentals are not unique to the Cape, but coupled with our desirable location, they make up a significant portion of our housing stock and particularly our rental housing stock. And these are units that may sit vacant for most of the year and are still more profitable for the property owner. Jay, do you want to run us through the Provincetown example?
Sure. So this is data that's actually now 6 years old, but the town of Provincetown hired the Public Policy Center at UMass Dartmouth to do an analysis of the housing challenges within the town of Provincetown. And what this study found was that the median rent on a year-round two-bedroom condo would at that time bring in about between $12,000 and $15,000 a year. However, with an average rental rate for an Airbnb of $254 a night, and I actually heard a report last week at a housing meeting in Provincetown that average rate for an Airbnb in Provincetown is actually now well over $350 a night. That a homeowner could rent their condo, particularly a second homeowner rents out their condo for just 20 weeks and brings in more than double the amount in rental income. And then has the ability of grabbing one of those weeks in the middle of the summer for themselves and coming down in the off season to enjoy their property. And so as a result of this ability to do short-term rentals, there's absolutely no incentive whatsoever for a homeowner. And in fact, it can cost them $18,000 a year to rent their house out year round versus being on the short-term rental market.
Thank you. You can definitely dig into that report on your own. It also includes a range of housing production strategies that the town identified, which we would definitely agree with. So then, of course, zoning. Zoning is one of the reasons why we don't have the housing that we need. So whatever your zoning makes it easiest to build, that is what you're going to see more of. The Cape's overwhelming development pattern is single-family homes on 1-acre lots, because that is what most of our towns are zoned for. What we will be talking about later on is that we believe that in order to address the housing crisis within a time frame that supports anyone that is already living, we're going to need to allow dense development in village centers, not everywhere, but where it makes sense. And that's called multifamily zoning. So that is multifamily zoning in every town on the Lower Cape where it makes sense is something that we are advocating for through the Lower Cape Community Housing Partnerships. I do want to give a nod to accessory dwelling units. Towns have changed their bylaws around allowing accessory dwelling units, which used to be called in-law apartments. It can be attached or detached, or a lot of different types of accessory dwelling units, also known as ADUs. We have a partnership with Homeless Prevention Council to support the production of ADUs throughout the Lower Cape through our Lower Cape Housing and ADU Resource Center. So if you or anyone you know is interested in building an ADU, please do reach out to us and we will help with permitting and thinking through the budget and how to make that work. ADUs are a tool. Addressing the housing crisis is going to take many tools. We have to use all the tools in our toolbox. ADUs are one of them. What is attractive about ADUs is that it allows you to build more units within existing zoning and within existing infrastructure. We would argue that that's not enough. We need to do ADUs and multifamily zoning, but ADUs certainly are one way to address the housing crisis, and it is a meaningful way. infrastructure goes hand in hand with zoning. Because at the end of the day, your zoning needs to be reflective of what infrastructure you have to protect the natural environment around us. So when we're talking about infrastructure, we're primarily talking about municipal water and sewer. And this is what determines how many people can occupy a unit of land, right? So when you have a septic system, your septic system is for a certain number of bedrooms. And in the same way, if we had sewer, for example, you would be able to have a lot more units in the same area of land, which would allow you to build more densely, and then you could have multifamily zoning. So infrastructure and zoning go together. Historically, towns have not allowed for infrastructure as a strategy to curb development, especially housing development. And so there is a reason why we don't have municipal water and sewer. Some towns have had this conversation for a very long time and it's been very contentious. And there's a reason for that, and it goes back beyond the Cape. It's a national conversation and challenge. And then finally, the lack of public support is a major barrier to the housing that we need on the Cape. And I should say the perceived lack of support, because we do think that many people support housing because they need it, because we need it. However, folks, generally speaking, folks who need housing are usually working multiple jobs to make ends meet here on the Cape, or taking care of children, or are uncomfortable speaking up at a town meeting or a committee meeting. So when we think about lack of public support, or NIMBYism, NIMBY stands for not in my backyard, usually we're talking about a subset of our communities as opposed to the entire community. So we have some notes here about how we think folks can think through decision-making at the municipal level to be more inclusive, so that we can make space for hearing the more pro-housing voices in our communities that usually don't show up at the meetings where we hear the NIMBY voices. A paper that I'd like to point you all to is a study from Boston University that showed that most of the people who show up at planning board meetings to voice their concerns are disproportionately older, male, and white. And they provide a very specific and limited point of view. And they're also shaping our local policies about how land is and is not used. And anytime you have a very specific demographic having the loudest voice, it's just important to be aware that that is not necessarily the voice that is representative of our community as a whole. And so again, we need to be mindful of our decision-making processes in town government to make sure that we are not only hearing one voice, but that we're hearing all voices. So like I said, people who are not supportive of housing are known as NIMBYs, and no matter where you are, they generally make the same comments. And rather than getting into a conversation about how we think that not all NIMBY arguments are true, we would like to arm you with the data points that you need to be becoming conversant on in your own communities to have those meaningful conversations in your town. So again, once you look at this presentation, you can go back and figure out these price points or these data points for your specific town, and that'll give you a leg up in NIMBY conversations. So the first category of dissent is usually fiscal, anything having to do with money. This usually comes from a group of residents who believe mixed-use village-style development will create a major fiscal negative. One myth that I continue to hear, it's been a little while, but since 2017 when I started working on this program, I've been hearing this idea that affordable housing brings more children, and children are expensive, and children will weigh down the budgets of our school systems. When there are studies who show that actually single-family homes tend to have more children per unit. And what's doubly interesting here on the Outer Cape in particular is that school enrollment is down, and we actually need school enrollment to increase so that we can achieve the economies of scale within our school system. So this is just one little example of a story that we hear, a narrative that we hear in our communities that actually doesn't line up with fact. Another main category of dissent is traffic. Traffic is a really big concern with anyone, whether you're pro-housing or not, or somewhere in between. Traffic gets a lot of airspace. Many times the concern is not well-founded, and either way, you can just know for sure by doing a peer-reviewed traffic study. So when a developer applies to a town for a comprehensive permit, traffic will invariably come up. And if there is a concern, you do a study and you figure out, is traffic a concern or not? And then the next challenge is making sure that everyone involved, all the decision makers, agree with that peer-reviewed study, but I can't help you there. But my point is that with our tools to address these issues, and we should use them. So in any conversation about traffic, we encourage you to make the case for village center development because that will minimize traffic. Imagine a community where someone lives 15 minutes walking distance from where they work. We can do this, and it's better for the environment, and it's cheaper for everyone, and it's cheaper for the town. So rather than hearing why things won't work, there are solutions that we can focus on that make housing and village center development work better for everybody. Then density. We always hear about density when we're addressing a specific affordable housing development. This category of dissent usually comes from folks who believe that mixed use or village style development will create something completely out of character and become an irreversible mistake. So we would really like to encourage everyone to reframe the density conversation around design and place. So people often say that density is ugly, but that's a myth. Density actually says nothing about what something looks like. It just says how many units are on a space. Anything can be ugly, and dense development can certainly be beautiful. And there are a lot of examples. You can have a single family home that someone thinks is not beautiful, and you can have a large multi-unit development that is beautiful. It has to do with design, and you can have good design regardless of how many units are occupying the space. And there are many examples in New England of dense development that is beautiful. And in fact, we tend to think of them as being charming and quaint. And Provincetown is a perfect example. It's the most dense, I think it's the most dense town on the Cape, and it's a major tourist attraction. So we actually do embrace density. We just have a hard time equating it with specific sites when there's an actual affordable housing development in our communities.
And you could not recreate Provincetown under current zoning.
Current zoning, right.
Nor Chatham, another densely populated village center.
Right. So when you're having a conversation at the town level, maybe on social media, try to address it by developing a visual preference survey. So a visual preference survey is going to give you a sense of what people like without focusing on density. Don't ask things like, is this appropriate in your town? Yes or no. Instead, ask, well, what do you like about this image? What do you not like? And here are some examples of multifamily housing developments on your screen that are from our general region, Sally's Way and Truro and Wentworth Way and Martha's Vineyard. So you can have a conversation about what do you like about this? What do you not like about this? Compare images, have them focus on a particular aspect like the height, the setback. And if there is resistance to density in your community, don't do this online, but really work on reframing the conversation so that if people have specific design concerns, you can address those concerns and also have more dense development. And then the last category that we cannot ignore is people. So some people have wrong ideas about who needs or lives in affordable housing or multifamily housing. Don't let these ideas run rampant in your community without addressing them. People tend to agree that we want to attract more young families to the region, for example, but you can't do that without more housing. So make sure that you're addressing these contradictions and the common narratives that we hear in our community. When people have issues with affordable housing development, you might hear coded language that actually gets to racist or classist ideologies. Please do call that out. Make sure that we're not just letting these types of comments float out into the ether and become fact. Understand equity and weave that into your arguments that are in support of a particular development, and make sure that you are making the connections between what people say they want and the reality of housing production that's required in order to bring that vision to fruition. So those are the main categories of NIMBYism. And like I said, it really is amazing. If you're paying attention to specific projects, you will hear the exact same thing over and over. And the reason why that matters is that it means that you can plan for it and be proactive. So now we're going to move into who needs housing. Take it away, Jay.
So before we kind of dive into these kind of three different buckets around data, stories, and visuals, Andrea has just gone over a number of different data points, and there is lots of data and good data out there. And as part of making the case for why your particular community needs housing, to build more housing and create more housing and come up with more affordable housing, you're definitely going to need data. We'll talk a little bit about that. But I want to emphasize that it really is, however, it's the stories. It's the stories that people can relate to that explain the need for housing that are going to be the most powerful. And so a really good resource here for data on housing is Shelterforce, and there's a link there in the presentation for you to learn more about that. But let's delve into some of the data. So there are lots of different sources. The income levels that we use to describe area median income, or AMI, that all comes from the Department of Housing and Urban Development. It is data that HUD puts out every spring on a county by county basis, and that's the data that we use to target different income levels within a community. The Cape Cod Commission is also a really great source of data, and their website called Stats Cape Cod. And there's also another great data point or source called Stats America. But in knowing data, there are kind of three different areas of helping understand the regional market, understanding what the need is, and then also understanding area median income. So let's talk about the regional market. It's really helpful if you can look at housing units and as they relate to income. And this is a chart that was produced by the Cape Cod Commission that really kind of shows in blue year-round housing production versus second home housing production. And you can see, though, in about 2010, we started as a region producing more second homes than year-round homes, and year-round home production actually dipped a little bit and has remained relatively flat. Yet we also have population growth. I think one of the big surprises of the 2020 census was seeing rates of population growth that exceed the growth rate for the state of Massachusetts. And those growth rates are particularly high on the Outer Cape in Eastham, Wellfleet, Truro, and Provincetown. But we're also seeing incredible growth in real estate prices. This is a really great chart you can find on Data Cape Cod, which shows particularly the impact of the COVID real estate boom, that we see a significant increase. And in fact, the most up-to-date stats on this, as I said earlier, in Barnstable counties, we're now looking at $750,000 as the median home price. Yet inventory, the number of houses that are available and on the market, has been declining significantly. And in fact, in the month of June 2022, there were only 150 houses on the market in Barnstable County, so all of Cape Cod, that were priced under $1 million. Next slide, Belinda. So let's delve into a bit of understanding the housing need. So we need more housing for people who are making low to moderate incomes. And even though we talk a lot about the need for what we like to call community housing, rather than workforce housing, because the reality is that people who live in traditional affordable housing work. And in fact, half of the residents in the 100 units that we own and manage at the CDP all have jobs. Those jobs just don't pay enough to be able to afford housing that's not subsidized. So we like to use the term, rather than using workforce housing, to describe people who make more than 80% of area median income. We prefer to call that community housing. And we talk a lot about community housing and how difficult it is, and how school teachers and town employees and carpenters and hospitality workers make too much money to qualify for affordable housing. But the reality is that anytime you do a lottery to rent up a new development, the category with the greatest demand and the fewest units to meet that demand are what we call very low income housing. And those are families basically surviving on less than $30,000 a year, making 30% of median area income or less. So it's really important to, in order to truly understand the housing need in the region and in your particular community, to conduct a needs assessment. And there are lots of examples in each of the towns doing housing production plans or housing needs assessments. Both Wellfleet and Truro are in the process of doing needs assessments, and typically communities do a needs assessment every 3 to 5 years. They bring in a consultant to be able to look at the data, can really then identify what the current needs are in the community.
If anyone has questions about housing production plans, housing coordinator from Brewster, Jill Scalisi, is here and can talk about the one they just finalized.
But definitely try searching your town's website to get a hold of the needs assessment or housing production plan. And then 2, to just kind of help us with what is area median income. So these are the figures that were released for 2022 that came out in June. And actually these figures have actually increased significantly over the last year, which reflects national trends and state trends in wage growth. But the median family income, so half of the residents of Barnstable County earn more than $150,000 a year, and half of the residents earn less than $115,000. In traditional affordable, deed-restricted affordable housing, we tend to group housing units in 3 different buckets, and they often, a particular unit of housing is tied to a particular income level based on the source of the subsidy that was used to build and operate it. And so the 3 different buckets that we have are extremely low income, and usually those are for rental only, that people just at 30% of AMI are just not making enough money to own and maintain a home. And those rental units all only exist with a rental subsidy that allows the homeowner to pay 30% of their income on their rent. And then the difference between what that is, it's typically $200 to $300 a month for the family, and what it costs to actually operate that unit, which is over $1,000 a month. That gap gets made up by a rental program such as Section 8 or the Massachusetts rental voucher program. The next bucket are very low income, which are at 50 and sometimes 60% of area median income. And we'll talk a bit later about the low income housing tax credit program, which is the largest source of funds to build affordable housing. The income ranges there, you can see, are for the people who are in those kinds of units, range from $38,000 to a single to $58,000 for a family of 5. But you can see that even in these ranges, that when you introduce two income earners into a household, it becomes very difficult for a family to qualify at the 50 to 60% range, and that typically pushes them into the next range, 80% of AMI or above 80% of AMI. And those are units too that are also harder to build because there are not as many subsidy sources for the 80% of AMI.
Jay, before you get into these,
Yeah.
I just want to share with folks that a lot of the data points for the region that we're sharing are from their regional housing market study, which is being updated this year. So we're showing pre-COVID figures, and we'll look forward to sharing out those updated figures once they complete their study.
So this data really is a great way of translating those that table that I just showed you into, all right, so what does this mean? What kind of jobs? Who are the people in our community? And, you know, as you can see in Orleans, in order for somebody to rent an apartment, you know, in kind of the typical jobs in our you know, community, to afford a $850 a month rent, it kind of shows you how many people you need or income earners you would need in a household in order to earn that. And to own, you know, that it's very difficult to own that are a lot of our just the typical jobs in our community just don't provide enough income for home ownership. And so this focuses on the Outer Cape towns, and you can see it's even more difficult on the Outer Cape to be able to afford rents on the Outer Cape in typical job categories that we have on the Outer Cape. So all that data, as I said earlier, is helpful. But I think what really is most compelling are stories and painting a picture. And I think it's really helpful that in trying to make the case, if we can collect and share local anecdotes of people who need housing. And so two examples of that are a media campaign that the CDP launched several years ago called "We Can't Afford to Lose the People Who Can't Afford to Live Here." It was a print ad campaign with a video component that really tells the story of a local shop owner, a family with a husband who's a fisherman, and a retired a couple who all struggle to afford housing on the Lower and Outer Cape.
We don't usually show the video, but people can see it on their own time when we send out their presentation. But can you talk a little bit about it, Jay?
Yeah, so Harbor Hill is a 28-unit development in the town of Provincetown that was created by a housing trust that's unique to the town of Provincetown to fund housing for people who earn too much money to qualify for affordable housing. So they it's for people at 80% to 200% of AMI. This project was financed through property taxes in the town of Provincetown, and we created a video to help secure additional funding for that project in Provincetown. And there are a bunch of really great stories of the people who live at Harbor Hill in Provincetown. And then two, also using visuals. I think, you know, rather than kind of tables and charts and data, using infographics and reports and maps and story maps. These are all other great ways of telling the story of who needs affordable housing in our community.
All right, so now I'm going to talk a little bit about what it can look like. So the elephant in the room is that historically, affordable housing didn't used to look so great. But thanks to the Fair Housing Act creating rules against segregation, we know that affordable housing developments are more successful when they mirror organic neighborhoods that are made up of diverse households, especially diverse incomes. And we do often hear that towns want to build more senior housing, for example, which is age restricted. But we would argue that the needs of seniors are actually really similar to the needs of, say, millennials. And the future is intergenerational housing that allows for, say, 1-bedroom or smaller units, as well as units for families that meet the needs of seniors and other groups of folks in our communities. So we advocate for mixed income developments. Some local examples. Let's say the same, it's interesting. The same person that can say that a large single family home looks great on their street might also say that the same design does not look so great if it houses 4 people or 4 households in it. And so this gets back to not worrying so much about how many units are in a structure, but instead focusing on what it looks like and not so much what's going on inside the building. These are some examples of local developments, community housing resource project at Meadow Road and Stable Path in Old Ann Page Way, as well as our own Thankful Chases Pathway in Harwich. These are examples of architecture that most people drive by and say, wow, that's really pretty, and don't necessarily know that they're subsidized.
And if I could add, I'm actually speaking to you this morning from my home, which is right next to Stable Path in Provincetown. I live in a market rate condo that was built right next door. And when friends come to visit me, they have no idea that 20 of my neighbors are all living in subsidized affordable housing.
Exactly. I also wanted to mention that a while ago, the Cape Cod Commission did a visual preference survey in several towns, including Eastham, where our office is and where I live. And a really surprising outcome, I remember that night well, was that many people were happy with more modern designs, even as they clung to these ideas of community character. And it could be because the Outer Cape has a history of modern house design, but it just goes to having these conversations around design can often lead to an awareness that folks do actually embrace a certain level of density or different types of design than they might say they do initially or think they do. So we've talked about density a little bit. We'll touch on a couple more points. Housing, we've maintained. Housing can be dense and it can look good and it can fit within your community. And we really need to embrace density, including focusing on developments of 40 units or more. A few reasons are it takes the same amount of time, energy, and engagement to build 10 units of housing versus 100 units of housing. Very low income households need the support of on-site property management, and developments with fewer than 40 units cannot support on-site property management. A major source of subsidy is a low income tax credit. We'll touch on that later. And when that's removed, it leaves a huge gap other than town sources, and the low income tax credit can only be used for larger developments. Larger developments with increased density are the best way to have more mixed income intergenerational neighborhoods. And I think something that we don't talk about enough in our communities is that the best way to preserve open space and have more green space is through density. We can either build up or we can build out. And when you have a conversation about protecting open space, it's a really, talking about density is a useful way of finding commonalities between the open space community and the pro-housing community. So Jay, how does housing actually get built?
This is the hard part. So one of the great resources is available on the website of the Mass Housing Partnership on a place called the Housing Toolbox. And there are a whole set of great resources there for towns and local government, as well as for developers on how to get affordable housing built. But let's kind of do a little bit of a summary of it and start first with talking about development timelines, and you can see why it takes so long to develop affordable housing. So one of the first things to keep in mind is, I think there is almost universal consensus that a town should not be in the real estate development business. That the complexities and the knowledge and the experience and the flexibility that is needed to be able to actually build and create housing is just not something that a town government is built to do in an efficient and cost-effective manner. And so that the role that towns can play is partnering with developers, making land available, and providing a vision through a request for proposals to a developer, but to then engage either a for-profit or a non-for-profit developer to actually construct and then operate the housing. Because the reality is that development takes a lot of time, is really complicated, particularly when with the kind of zoning that we have in our communities. So let's touch on these kind of 6 different areas around development. So planning is really important for the beginning. Having a housing and needs assessment so that the town can really pinpoint what kind of housing it needs to build. Needing to do an analysis of the implementation capacity, like how much housing can a site or a community sustain? What are the goals that the town is trying to achieve, and what strategies can be used to achieve those goals? Whether it's building new housing, renovating or existing housing, or repurposing existing development, such as redeveloping underutilized retail developments. There's a real big opportunity in the town of Orleans. There's a lot of extra retail in downtown Orleans that could be redeveloped. But at the end of the day, what a town really needs is an action plan that is spelling out who is doing what, when, and what are the resources that are going to be needed to achieve the housing goals. So it's really important for a community to have a development strategy and a budget. And often this is what is undertaken by an affordable housing trust through their action plan. And what a development strategy does is it really assigns the roles and the activities, the who, what, where, and how a community's affordable housing needs are going to be met. And it's really an extension of a community's needs assessment. So it's the action plan once that needs assessment is done. And there's a great resources in the Mass Housing Partnerships Housing Toolbox on how to create a development strategy for a town. So this is different from a housing needs assessment or a housing production plan that really kind of paints what the need is. And the development strategy is the strategy for meeting that need. So once the strategy is figured out, then it's time to start with the very beginning. And the beginning work is really important in what's called pre-development and site assessment. And so this becomes a preliminary evaluation of a site. You know, I think lots of times we know that there's a piece of land or there's a parcel someplace in town, and we just immediately kind of jump to it. Oh, let's use this for affordable housing, rather than kind of going through the steps to make sure that that makes sense. And so what we need is an evaluation of the site that looks at the local and state regulations and does some preliminary engineering and conceptual site design. And most important, has preliminary financial feasibility analysis. So if that site is on a steep hill and can only accommodate 1 or 2 units of housing, it is highly unlikely to be financially feasible. And so it's really important too to think about, looking at a site and doing the feasibility of really understanding how does that site fit into the broader strategy, and how much money is going to need to be invested into that site, and what will the return on the investment will be, and will it get enough units to make a dent in affordable housing stock. The reality is that it takes about as much time, energy, effort, political will, and in many cases resources from municipal resources to build 2 or 3 units of housing as it does to build 40. And I'd argue that given the tremendous need that we have in our community, we need to be really strategic and be focusing on projects and strategies that are going to have a much higher yield, given the amount of time that it takes to create housing. So often when a community has a site that wants to use for affordable housing, it takes the advice that I just expressed earlier and puts out a request for proposals to the development community to then select a developer. And one of the key parts of this process is putting together an RFP. For the most part, towns need help putting together an RFP. And there are consultants and resources available through Mass Housing Partnership to do this. And there are plenty of examples where a community has come together to put together, a town has come together, put out an RFP and has used good consulting resources to try to craft that. It's really important that an RFP strikes the right balance between painting a picture of what the needs are and then what are the kind of housing that the town is looking, but it doesn't do it in such tremendous detail that it eliminates the ability of a developer to be able to be creative in responding to that request for proposal. So it needs to include affordable housing design and design guidelines, and how the land is going to be disposed of, but really, when an RFP is very, very prescriptive, it will really get you into trouble. So when an RFP is put out and proposals come in, and this is a pretty detailed process, and there are lots of great resources to get help with it, then it comes time to select a developer. And often that is done by a committee. So for example, in Wellfleet with the 95 Lawrence Road project, a committee was formed to look at a 6-acre parcel across the street from the elementary school called 95 Lawrence Road. That committee did a lot of community outreach. It looked at data and really assessed need. And then it also worked with a consultant from Mass Housing Partnership to craft a request for proposals, and then got help in evaluating those proposals. Chose the development team of the CDP and Preservation for Affordable Housing. They received 3 different proposals, and then that recommendation was made to the select board, who made the final decision to select a developer. So that's how that process should work. So once a developer is proposed, we should, one other step that is important though is the actual permitting of that. And so with 95 Lawrence Road being an example, we just received a comprehensive permit from the zoning board, which we worked very collaboratively with the town, and that permitting process was completed in a 8-week process with absolutely no opposition to the project whatsoever. Same thing just happened in Provincetown as well with a 65-unit project, a great collaboration between the developer and the town, and moved through the zoning board quite quickly. Then once it is permitted, it's time to then go out and get funding and financing, and then you go to construction. And the developer usually has selects a general contractor, has construction oversight, then engages in a marketing of the property and a lease up that is prescribed through a state approved fair housing marketing plan. Then there's also a plan to manage that property to make sure that the residents can be successful in living there, and that the property is maintained for the long term and remains a strong asset in the community. So once the funding is achieved, and funding is typically happens on a once-a-year basis through the state, but a closing is made on the permanent financing, and then we then want to have somebody needs to manage that. Most of the larger developers of property management have management firms that are subsidiaries or part of their organization. So for example, with Preservation of Affordable Housing has a division called POA Communities, which has a really strong ability to manage affordable housing units, not only management of the actual property, but also management of the community and the residents, and they have programs that can provide support services to residents to make sure that residents can be successful tenants in a property. And so really not any property management company, like somebody who maintains condos, for example, is in a position to do property management for affordable housing. It really is very much a specialized field. And then as well as doing the asset management, which is the kind of long-term planning to make sure that funds are being set aside to replace roofs in 20 years, to replace siding in 30 or 40 years, and make sure that that building is sustained for the long term. So the funding of affordable housing is really complicated, and there are lots of different buckets but these are really things that an experienced developer knows how to figure out how to go for those funds. One of the most important things that we have a role in is local funds. And in fact, having local funds is absolutely critical for a project to receive state and federal funding, that the state and federal government want to see that the town is supportive of the project and has skin in the game as well. And so a town can support the project in a variety of ways, from making land available. So for example, with the 95 Lawrence Road project, that is town-owned land that will be made available to the developer on a 99-year ground lease. Towns can also provide funding through the Community Preservation Act funding and or affordable housing trusts. There's also Barnstable County Home and Community Development Block Grant funds. Towns can also use free cash to help with funding. And we also have a number of new revenue sources to towns on the Lower and Outer Cape through the short-term rental tax funds that are being collected that should be being used for affordable housing. And in fact, at the CDP, we really argue that all of the short-term rental tax funds that towns are now collecting really ought to be being placed in housing trusts to use to help solve the affordable housing problem. There are also some additional legislative initiatives on the horizon for a transfer fee or deeds excise tax. But there are, you can see just a whole host of ways that local communities can bring resources to the table to partner with developers. Then there are the state and federal funding sources, and you can click on these links to learn a lot about all of the different ones. As I mentioned earlier, the largest a source of subsidy is the low-income housing tax credit, which is a federal source that is administered by each state. But let's look at an example, though, of the village at Nauset Green in Eastham, which is a project that was completed in late 2020. As you can see, when I said it takes a while to build for a project to come into fruition, it was May 2016 when the RFP was issued, and it took all the way to December of 2020 when that project was starting to be occupied. The cost of the 65 units there at Nauset Green, which kind of feels like a bargain these days at $23 million, saw funding from the Eastham CPA, $400,000 in infrastructure subsidy, so the town kind of paid for the road and the bearing of the power lines on that site. The town of Eastham also took money from its Affordable Housing Trust. The CPA committees in Orleans and Wellfleet each chipped in $100,000. But then you can see the greatest sources of funding came from state and federal funding and some borrowing. And so all in all, while those units cost about $400,000 a piece to build, the town of Eastham and the local contribution with the land and the CPA awards was about $35,000 per unit. But I think that's one of the beauties of doing projects like this, is that the town with a small investment is leveraging significantly more resources and getting a lot of housing for its investment. Whereas if the town just tries to subsidize it on its own without partnering with a developer. So all of this, though, is to say that it's a real balancing act, and in trying to make a project feasible, that you've got all of these different costs and then the different sources of income that all have to be balanced. And one of the things that can really throw this whole process off balance is time and money. And so the easier it is for a developer to partner with the town and develop a project and eliminate unpredictable factors, and also have resources available to leverage more state and federal resources, that's what's going to set up a project for success. And then finally, just some thoughts I want to share with you on property management. I think it is really important for a local project or project here on the Cape to be able to be working with a management entity that's already managing projects on the Cape. So both the CDP manages affordable housing for towns, and then also several of the larger developers have multiple properties on Cape Cod and have very locally centered housing management, affordable housing management agencies. And remember, I said earlier about how it's somebody, a firm that manages condos doesn't have the breadth of expertise and experience to be able to do affordable housing property management. One of the really critical things is avoiding scattered sites. I will tell you that at the CDP with our 100 units in 18 different locations, it costs us on a per unit basis a lot more money annually to manage a unit of affordable housing than it does for a developer who's got 40, 60, 100 units in one place. I would say that half of the time our maintenance employees spend is not actually fixing things, but driving from one project to the next because our properties are so dispersed. It's also becomes very difficult to have a diverse community and to be able to provide services on site. Have an on-site property manager when you've got a couple units that are scattered all over the region. And so we really strongly urge folks to not look at developing affordable scattered site rentals. That those scattered site developments are really much more appropriate for affordable home ownership opportunities.
So before I talk about what we need to get the best housing, I want to be mindful of the time. We are getting near the end, but if you do need to leave at 11:30, please do what you need to do to take care of yourself. We will continue to go through the slides and answer questions if you want to stick with us, but if you need to go, do what you need to do. So given what we've discussed, what do we need to do to get the best housing? The thing that I love about housing production is that we already know what it takes. It's really not a mystery. We know what needs to be done, and it's really about getting the consensus building work done to get everyone on the same page so that we all have the political will to move forward. Do not underestimate the importance of great community engagement. I think that since I started getting into this work in 2017, it's become more and more apparent to me that strategies and resources are important, but they are not useful if we don't have great community engagement and coalition building and consensus at the municipal level. Engagement can be used in 3 basic scenarios. Planning is one, a specific project, a specific affordable housing development or housing development is the second one, and then ongoing education. So having an ongoing conversation within your town and within your town government is critical to creating a culture of support for housing. But you have to be creative and you have to be intentional about that conversation. So we recommend that you map out who the community needs to hear from and how to best engage them. And you should be thinking about how to make the process more accessible to increase diverse input. Think about multiple ways of engaging. Towns really like doing surveys. Surveys are great. Surveys are one way, and there's a certain type of person who has the time to engage in a survey. So you need to have multiple ways for people to engage and be really strategic about your outreach. Think about what segments of your community are not being heard and the best way to reach them.
And Andrea, can I just add that, I think one of the main reasons why the 2 projects that just got permitted in the last few weeks in Provincetown and Wellfleet did so and had no opposition and moved through their permitting process quickly was because really good and community engagement work had been done. In both cases, we had staff out knocking on the doors and meeting with all of the neighbors of those projects. And there was really good community engagement early on in the process and even developing the RFP before the RFP was developed.
And again, when we're talking about community engagement, we're talking about from planning all the way through actually having a development completed and then ongoing. This needs to be a conversation that everyone in town is aware of and everyone understands the housing needs of the town and are all on the same page about what needs to be done. So we recommend that you think through what an engagement team is inside your town. We have noticed that towns that are particularly high functioning have really specific roles for different boards and committees in their town. And they usually engage a housing partnership or a housing committee. It's called something different in different towns, usually an affordable housing committee. And that group should really be focused on developing new initiatives, bringing them to the select board, and focusing on advocacy and education to the extent that your municipality allows that. The Affordable Housing Trust is definitely an important part of your engagement team. And it's really helpful if the trust focuses on specific initiatives, which is utilizing their trust funds for housing development. So when the Affordable Housing Committee in your town and the Housing Trust in your town have distinct and clear roles, those towns tend to be able to move the needle quicker. Your planning board is, of course, part of your engagement team because they are focused on zoning and master planning. Different towns have different planning board cultures when it comes to housing. But we would argue that in order to advance housing initiatives in your town, you need to have consensus at the government level, at the intra-municipal level, before you can expect to see that consensus in the community at large. And then finally, of course, your resources are your town staff and your consultants. When we started the Lower Cape Community Housing Partnership, there are only 2 towns with housing staff, and now there are many more. And it's been recognized that in order for housing initiatives to be advanced in your town, it actually needs to be someone's job because it's a lot of work. And so towns that have dedicated town staff that focus on housing initiatives really are more successful. From a planning perspective, community engagement can be useful at both when you're developing your local comprehensive plan as well as your housing production plan. So don't just think about community engagement as solely for your housing production plan. Anytime there is a plan in your town that can have a housing component, there needs to be a community engagement strategy to go with that plan to ensure that you're getting input from a broad range of demographics in your town. And so here are some local examples. Something that's been really interesting is that over the past few years, there have been 4 really large parcels or large sites in our communities that are slated to have a housing component. And so there have been committees dedicated to talk through what that site can hold. So I'm talking about the 70-acre Walsh property in Truro. I'm talking about the Tea Time site in Eastham, Governor Prince in Orleans, and the 100+ acres in Brewster. The committees that are being put together to think through what is going to occur in those sites have a really important task to build consensus within their community so that the process of actually getting housing developments in place is smooth, and that process starts at the original planning phase. It's never too early to start community engagement. When it comes to community engagement for a specific project, you do have to be more strategic because there's a saying in the housing sphere that everyone is supportive of affordable housing until it has an address. And unfortunately, we do see that play out over and over and over again. So your community engagement process does need to be tailored for specific sites, and it needs to be strategic. So being really mindful of who the key players are in your community, how you are partnering with them to get the message out, how you're handling misinformation, which will inevitably occur, and how you're maintaining strong communication between the town and the residents in a way that allows for trust to be built and clarity. And then finally, ongoing education. Even when an affordable housing development is built and done and ready to go, there is still tremendous need in our community that is not going to be met with one project. So we need to be continuing these conversations at the town level to be building consensus and making sure that everybody understands what the needs are. And here are some reasons. I won't get into all of them, but Dr. Tiffany Manuel has an incredible body of work around coalition building and consensus building when it comes to housing and other aspects of community building. And you should definitely check out her website. It gives you great tools for how to have these conversations within your community. We talked a little bit about how in order to address the affordable housing crisis, we need to have zoning that is appropriate to scale up our efforts, and infrastructure, as we mentioned before, is a really important piece of this. We don't suggest that every single town needs sewer in the entire town. Title V does generally do a good job, but if you agree that we need to be focusing on village center development that is dense, then we ought to be thinking about sewering in our towns where it makes sense, in the village center and in major roads. So that's a conversation that some towns are more poised to have than others, but it definitely is a very clear need. In order to have multifamily zoning and multifamily development, we do need to be considering the wastewater treatment options so we can scale up those developments. And of course, municipal water allows us to put more units per acre of land as well. Better zoning, as we mentioned before, you're going to get the zoning, you're going to get the development that your zoning allows most easily. So we need to be deciding as a community, as a region, where it makes sense to have multifamily housing and then zoning for it. Some folks might say that, well, we can just use Chapter 40B, and I agree, that is a tool. But the benefit of zoning is that zoning is the way that we communicate as a community where we all believe that housing belongs. And that kind of consensus building goes a really long way in addressing the time variable when it comes to specific development by shortening the time frame. And then, of course, we talked about the reasons why housing development is more expensive on the Cape. In order to build the type of high quality housing that we need to address the housing crisis in a way that protects open space, mitigates climate change, is energy efficient, and meets the needs of the future, we need to be allocating funding sources, local funding sources to housing. And you'll find some, these are links to organizations that can give you support around strategies and messaging. Jay touched a little bit on the different types of funding sources. This list is really meant to be more of a resource for you to come back to. But as he said, the short-term rental tax is a really critical resource that towns need to be using. And the great thing about the short-term rental tax is that there's no restriction on the household income that it can support. So for towns that are trying to deal with the community housing needs of their town, the short-term rental tax is a way to address that. This is just to give you a sense of what kind of money is coming into towns through the short-term rental tax. You can go to the state's tax, DOR, what does it stand for? Department of, oh, I'm sorry, I don't know the name, but you can go see the actual receipts. And what we're trying to demonstrate here is that we're talking about millions of dollars that are flowing through our communities that can be used to address housing. Oh, and also we linked here to an op-ed that the CDP did with homeless prevention councils that you can use language from to help make the case for allocating short-term rental revenues for housing in your community. Department of Revenue. Yeah. Strengthening your housing trust. A lot of communities have already done what we recommend, which is switching your affordable housing trust from the old type of housing trust to the new type, which is a municipal affordable housing trust. I won't get into the details of what a municipal affordable housing trust is, but as you're thinking through ways that you want to intervene in your own town, making sure that your town has a municipal affordable housing trust is an important strategy to be aware of, and strengthening the trust by making sure it's armed with an action plan, making sure it has clearly delineated roles from your affordable housing committee, and making sure that you have steady and stable, predictable streams of revenue going into your trust can help your town achieve its housing production goals by bringing more certainty into the mix. And then, of course, I mentioned before that it's really important to have someone on staff in your town who is working on housing. And many of the towns in our region now do, not all, but many. And finally, regional collaboration. One of the things that's kind of interesting about the Lower Cape region, which is actually not common in the rest of the state, is that towns on the Lower Cape are recognizing that the regional housing market doesn't respect town lines. And so towns are providing Community Preservation Act funding for developments that are not in their town to support just housing production across the region in general. And we also recognize that it's really important for towns to be working together because they have very similar challenges and needs, and there's no point in reinventing the wheel by only having conversations within your town when there can be more partnerships across borders, more sharing of resources, more sharing of data and strategies. And that's one of the things that we try to support through the Lower Cape Housing Institute. So to wrap up, if you'd like to reach out to us, our contact information is on the screen. The Lower Cape Housing Institute provides programming for elected and appointed municipal officials, social service agencies, and other housing advocates over the course of the year outside of the summer. We are going to have a workshop on zoning basics for rural communities in November. In January, we'll be talking about affordable housing and sustainable communities from an energy efficiency and design perspective. We'll do a mini workshop in February on our Lower Cape Housing and ADU Resource Center for folks who want to learn more about how we're supporting accessory dwelling unit production. We'll do a funding workshop in March. People always want to know more about funding and financing, even though it's the developer's area of expertise, but we are trying to support everyone in having more confident and effective conversations about housing production. And then you can look out for our annual town meeting summary after town meeting season ends. I'm going to open it up to questions in just a moment. But the last thing that I wanted to say was that if you're interested in getting involved and you're not an elected or appointed municipal official, we've given you the language and tools so that you can be more confident in these housing conversations in your community. But if there is something specific that you want to get involved in, the CDP is building out an advocacy program. And so you should get in touch with us and we can help you get plugged in and be more strategic about advancing housing production in your community overall. Okay, I'm going to do some tech magic here. And if anyone, Pelinda, if you want to shout out a question from the chat, if there are any, we can start dealing with them. I can't see the chat right now.
At this time, there are no questions in the chat.
Well, that's easy. Everybody knows everything. I'm gonna stop sharing this.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes. Hello, Charles.
Yeah. Hi. I just had a quick question. I mean, the has to do with funding and local funds. When funds are provided by the town in the form of a grant, is as opposed to a loan or some other source. I mean, basically, we're contributing. I mean, these developers are mostly not for profits. I mean, and their profits, as you point out, are limited. But what kind of commitments, in addition, should we be looking for when we're offering grants, sizable grants? You know, 35,000 per unit. Such as, you know, I mean, we're basically contributing to their equity in the project, which we don't have an interest in at that point. I mean, is there things, I know in Provincetown this happened recently, and we got a commitment for they will maintain ownership for quite a considerable amount of time. But are there any things that we should be thinking about when we are giving money as opposed to lending money in these situations?
So I would say that, you know, there's certainly things that can be discussed as part of the negotiation. And you know, I would say there are a lot of things in terms of protecting the town's money that other parties, both public and private, who have way more money than a town will ever put in, are going to cover for you. So you don't need, a town doesn't need to worry about, you know, the building inspection. The town doesn't need to worry about the financial feasibility of the whole project. I mean, they're not going to get state and federal funding for a project that doesn't make sense. But I think where the town can really focus on is, and like even the affordability restriction, like you want a in perpetuity deed restriction on the property, and that is pretty much, you know, they used to be 30 and 40 year deed restrictions in the past, and in the last 15-20 years that's pretty much been eliminated. That now all projects require to be restricted in perpetuity. There, you know, might be things that kind of working in partnership with the developer early on, like an emphasis on that you want a net zero design project, that you don't want to allow any fossil fuels to be used in the project, that those are all things that could be kind of negotiated if you also have energy efficiency goals. or the bedroom count. I mean, that you can guarantee a certain number of units that are actually above 80% of area median income, and so that you have a broader range of income diversity. So I think those are the kinds of things that can be conditions of a project when the town contributes to it.
Thank you.
I see your hand, Rob.
Hi, this is Rob Michaels. I had a question about, one of the important things on the Cape is environmental protection, and it's the fact that, septic tanks or septic systems, generate problems for the environment. Is there any way to tie in these density arguments and so forth to the, protecting the environment? I mean, some communities obviously can't put in sewer systems, like, Brewster, I've heard, cannot put in because of the density. So are there any arguments you can make in favor of density that would also tie into environmental protection and
Yeah.
phosphate generation and things like that?
So clearly, the larger the project, the more water treatment solutions are going to be available. And so, like, for example, in Wellfleet, that's actually a great partnership with the town. The town is going to build a wastewater treatment facility to treat the wastewater at the school, the police station, the fire station, and a small, very sensitive neighborhood. So having 46 units of housing being part of that mix is what's going to make that a small wastewater treatment facility economically viable. So I would argue that it's when we do density and can either build it in an area that's already sewered or is going to be sewered, that it becomes a win-win, both addressing our housing crisis as well as our water quality challenges.
Thanks.
Anybody else? Going once, going twice. Thank you all so much for being here with us. Like I said, we'll send out the recording and you'll be on our newsletter, and now you're part of the Lower Cape Housing Institute family, and you'll be hearing much more from us. So have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.